The studio lights blazed down on the view set like interrogation lamps, too bright, too unforgiving. Cameras were rolling. Producers were calm, or at least pretending to be. From the outside, it looked like another polished daytime segment. Another royal interview. Another carefully managed conversation. But something was off. Prince Harry sat upright in his chair, hands folded, expression composed but alert, the kind of stillness that comes from years of being watched, judged, dissected. Across the table, Joy Behar leaned forward, eyes sharp, smile tight. The audience sensed it before the words were spoken. That familiar electric tension. The kind that makes people stop scrolling and lean closer to the screen. Then it happened. An unexpected interruption cut through the conversation, abrupt, unscripted, and loaded with intent. Joy didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words landed with surgical precision, questioning Harry's motives, his credibility, his reasons for speaking out at all. It wasn't framed as curiosity. It was framed as accusation. A ripple moved through the studio. Harry blinked once. The audience murmured. One of the co-hosts shifted uncomfortably in her seat. This wasn't the tone they'd rehearsed. This wasn't the friendly exchange viewers had been promised. Joy pressed on. Was this really about truth? Or was this about attention? About money? About resentment? The air thickened. You could almost hear the producers in the control room holding their breath. This was no longer a conversation, it was a challenge, delivered live, with nowhere to hide. For a split second, it looked like Prince Harry might laugh it off. That's what people expected. A deflection. A royal smile. A diplomatic dodge. Instead, his jaw tightened. The tone of the room shifted instantly, like a storm rolling in without warning. Polite. Applause died in the audience's throats. A few gasps escaped before people could stop themselves. This wasn't just uncomfortable anymore. It was volatile. Two worlds were colliding in real time, a media powerhouse used to controlling the narrative, and a man who had spent his entire life being defined by narratives he didn't create. The clash was no longer subtle. It was visible. Audible. Inevitable. And as Harry leaned forward, finally ready to respond, one thing became painfully clear to everyone watching: this interview was about to go completely off the rails. But what happened in the minutes that followed wasn't just a heated exchange, it became one of the most talked about moments in daytime TV history. To understand how that moment detonated live on air, you have to rewind, not just minutes, but years. Prince Harry wasn't on The View by accident. This wasn't a casual pop-in or a light promotional tour. His appearance had been billed as a conversation, a chance to explain himself, to address critics, to reframe a story that had spiraled far beyond his control. Officially, he was there to talk about mental health, service, and life beyond the royal institution. Unofficially, everyone knew it was something else. For weeks, speculation had been swirling. Commentators argued over whether Harry was a whistleblower or a grifter, a victim or a provocateur. Headlines framed him as everything from a courageous truth-teller to a disgruntled prince who couldn't let go. Social media had already chosen sides long before he ever stepped onto that set. And The View, a show built on confrontation, commentary, and cultural power, was the perfect battlefield. From the moment the interview began, the questions were deceptively polite. Carefully worded. Softened with smiles. The kind of questions that sound neutral but carry weight beneath the surface. Why now? Why speak out again? Why keep revisiting the past? Each question wasn't just about Harry. It was about credibility. About motive. About whether his story deserved sympathy, or skepticism. Harry answered calmly. Deliberately. He spoke about pressure, about growing up inside an institution where silence was currency and obedience was survival. He talked about wanting to protect his family, about stepping away rather than lashing out. His tone was measured, almost restrained. But restraint can be threatening. Because when someone refuses to explode, it forces everyone else to reveal their intentions. As the conversation unfolded, the deeper tension began to surface, not between two people, but between two worlds. Royalty versus media. Private pain versus public consumption. Truth as lived experience versus truth as something filtered, packaged, and sold. This wasn't just about Prince Harry anymore. It was about who gets to control the narrative in modern America. And outside the studio, the reaction was already snowballing. Clips were being posted in real time. Tweets were firing off mid-sentence. Comment sections were splitting into camps, some praising Harry's composure, others accusing him of playing the victim yet again. Hashtags began trending before the segment even reached its halfway mark. The world wasn't just watching. It was judging. Every pause, every word choice, every facial expression carried consequences. A single misstep could confirm critics' worst assumptions. A single sharp response could be reframed as entitlement or arrogance. The pressure was immense, and everyone at that table knew it. That's when the questions started to shift. They stopped being about events. And started being about intent. Was Harry telling his story to heal, or to profit? Was this advocacy, or revenge dressed up as vulnerability? Was he challenging power, or exploiting it? The atmosphere tightened with each passing second. Even the audience could feel it, this was no longer a safe conversation. The margin for error had vanished. Joy Behar, seasoned and unflinching, leaned in, not just physically, but rhetorically. Her words became sharper. Less padded. Less forgiving. The kind of probing that doesn't just seek answers, but forces a reckoning. And that's when the balance of the room began to tilt. Because when Joy dug deeper, the tone shifted, and suddenly no one could predict what Harry would do next. To understand why this confrontation unfolded the way it did, you have to understand the power sitting across the table from Prince Harry. Joy Behar wasn't just another co-host. She wasn't a passive moderator or a neutral observer. She was, and had been for decades, a cultural force. A veteran of television debates, political commentary, and public sparring matches that routinely went viral long before virality had a name. On The View, Joy occupied a specific role, the sharp edge. Her persona was built on confidence, wit, and the ability to say what others wouldn't, or wouldn't dare, say on daytime television. She had made a career out of cutting through pleasantries, puncturing egos, and pressing guests until they slipped. To her fans, that made her fearless. To her critics, it made her abrasive. Either way, it made her powerful. Joy didn't just ask questions. She challenged narratives. Over the years, viewers had watched her dismantle politicians, clash with celebrities, and shut down talking points with a single raised eyebrow or perfectly timed quip. She thrived in moments of friction. Silence didn't intimidate her. Awkwardness didn't slow her down. If anything, it fueled her. And that confidence, honed by years of applause and validation, often blurred into something else. Control. On The View, Joy wasn't just participating in the conversation. She helped define it. The table wasn't neutral ground, it was her terrain. Guests came in knowing the rules, knowing the rhythm, knowing who held the advantage. Most adjusted accordingly. Most softened their answers. Most tried to charm their way through. But Prince Harry didn't fit the usual mold. Still, Joy approached him the way she approached everyone else, assuming the format would hold, assuming the balance of power would remain intact. After all, she'd sparred with senators, journalists, even presidents. A prince-turned-public figure. That didn't faze her. And beneath her questions was something deeper than skepticism. Joy had long positioned herself as a defender of media accountability. Of questioning privilege. Of pushing back against what she and her audience saw as inherited power cloaked in sympathy. To her, Harry wasn't just a man telling his story, he was a symbol. Of royalty. Of institutions. Of narratives that, in her view, deserved scrutiny rather than deference. Her sharp tongue had shaped countless public conversations this way, framing debates, steering audience perception, setting the tone for how millions would interpret a moment. When she questioned a guest's motives, it wasn't just curiosity. It was a signal to viewers, look closer. Don't accept this at face value. That influence carried weight. But it also carried risk. Because when confidence hardens into certainty, it leaves little room for miscalculation, and even less room for humility. Joy had faced pushback before, but she was rarely forced to reconsider her footing mid-conversation. The studio, the format, the applause, they all reinforced the same assumption: she was in control. What she underestimated was the gravity of the moment, and the man sitting across from her. Harry wasn't there to score points. He wasn't running for office. He wasn't selling a punchline. He carried decades of public scrutiny, personal loss, and institutional conflict into that chair. And unlike many guests, he wasn't playing defense for a brand or a campaign. He was defending something far more fragile. His lived experience. Joy's questions, sharpened by years of debate, cut closer than perhaps she intended. What she framed as accountability landed as dismissal. What she saw as skepticism felt, to him, like erasure. And in that gap between intention and impact, tension began to coil. The audience could feel it, that subtle but unmistakable shift when a familiar dynamic starts to wobble. When the person used to steering the exchange realizes the wheel isn't responding the way it should. Joy pressed forward anyway. Because that's what seasoned provocateurs do. But as she leaned into her role, defender of narrative, challenger of privilege, master of the table, she failed to recognize one critical truth: this wasn't a routine sparring match. And as confident as she felt in that moment, as firmly as she believed she held the upper hand, she was about to discover something she hadn't anticipated at all. Yet even as she thought she had the upper hand, Harry was no ordinary guest. Long before the studio lights, the debates, and the viral headlines, Prince Harry's life had already been lived in public. From the moment he could walk, cameras followed. Every smile was analyzed. Every mistake magnified. He wasn't just a child, he was an image, a symbol, a living extension of an institution older than memory itself. While other boys learned who they were in private, Harry learned who the world expected him to be. And that expectation was suffocating. He grew up inside a paradox, adored by millions, yet profoundly alone. Applauded in public, scrutinized in private. The press didn't just document his life, it shaped it. Headlines didn't ask questions, they declared conclusions. And over time, those conclusions hardened into identities he never chose. Rebel. Spare. Problem prince. Behind the palace walls, there were moments of warmth and purpose, service trips, military duty, causes that gave him direction. But there were also moments of profound loss and confusion, moments that never fully healed. Grief didn't disappear just because it was royal. Trauma didn't soften because it wore a crown. The media, relentless and unyielding, rarely paused to consider that. As Harry grew older, the scrutiny intensified. Every relationship became a story. Every disagreement became a scandal. And every attempt to speak honestly was reframed as weakness or entitlement. When he tried to laugh it off, he was accused of immaturity. When he grew serious, he was labeled unstable. There was no winning, only surviving. The turning points came quietly at first. A growing awareness that silence wasn't protection. That compliance didn't guarantee peace. That playing the role assigned to him meant slowly disappearing inside it. He watched the cost of that silence mount, not just for himself, but for the people he loved. And at some point, something shifted. Harry began to understand that stepping away wasn't betrayal, it was self-preservation. That speaking out wasn't attention-seeking, it was a refusal to be erased. That telling his story, imperfect as it was, might be the only way to reclaim ownership of it. But that choice came with consequences. Once you break from the script, you don't just lose favor, you invite punishment. Critics accused him of hypocrisy, of ingratitude, of exploiting his title while pretending to reject it. Every word he spoke was filtered through suspicion. Every motive questioned. Even his vulnerability was treated as strategy. And yet, he kept showing up. Not because it was easy, but because retreat had already taught him what silence cost. By the time he sat down at the View, Harry wasn't naive. He knew the room he was walking into. He understood the optics, the skepticism, the traps hidden inside polite questions. He had faced worse than raised voices. He had endured years of being talked about instead of listened to. What made this moment different wasn't fame. It was resolve. He wasn't there to perform royalty. He wasn't there to beg for approval. He was there as a man who had spent decades having his identity dissected by strangers, and who had finally decided to answer back, calmly and deliberately. That's what many in the audience sensed, even if they couldn't articulate it. There was a gravity to his presence. A restraint that came not from training, but from exhaustion. From knowing that anger would be used against him, and composure might be the only shield left. Harry carried fears into that chair, fears of being misquoted, dismissed, reduced once again to a caricature. But he also carried resilience. The kind forged by loss, criticism, and the hard-earned understanding that dignity doesn't require permission. In that studio, across from seasoned commentators and a culture hungry for conflict, he wasn't defending a brand or a monarchy. He was defending his right to define himself. That's what made the tension so palpable. This wasn't a celebrity sparring for relevance. This was a human being pushing back against a machine that had defined him since childhood. And as Joy Behar leaned forward, questions sharpening, assumptions hardening, Harry didn't flinch. Because this wasn't just another interview. This was a man defending not just ideas, but dignity itself. At first, it still looked salvageable. The conversation resumed with practiced politeness, the kind that lives just above discomfort. Smiles returned, briefly. The cadence softened. Joy nodded as Harry spoke, letting him finish his sentences. The audience exhaled, thinking perhaps the moment had passed. But tension doesn't disappear. It waits. Harry continued explaining his perspective, choosing his words carefully, almost methodically. His voice stayed even. His posture remained composed. He spoke about intention, about responsibility, about why telling his story mattered, not as spectacle, but as context. Joy listened. Then she tilted her head. And that's when the tone changed. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't an insult. It was a single cutting phrase, delivered calmly, wrapped in a question that felt more like a verdict than curiosity. A line that implied his words weren't about truth, but leverage. That his experiences were less testimony and more tactic. The effect was immediate. The camera caught it before the audience did, a subtle tightening in Harry's jaw. A pause half a second longer than before. His eyes flicked up. Locking forward, no longer scanning the table but fixing on the moment itself. The studio went quiet. Joy pressed on, doubling down, framing his narrative as selective, suggesting contradictions, hinting that silence from others told a different story. Her words came faster now, sharper, each one stacking pressure onto the last. Harry didn't interrupt. That alone unsettled the room. Most guests jumped in defensively, talked over the accusation, tried to soften the blow. Harry waited. He let the silence stretch. The audience shifted in their seats. One co-host glanced sideways, sensing the imbalance growing. When Harry finally spoke, his voice was still calm, but something had changed. The softness was gone. He corrected one point. Then another. Not emotionally. Precisely. Each sentence landed deliberately, as if placed rather than thrown. He acknowledged complexity without conceding his reality. He didn't raise his voice, he narrowed it. Joy leaned back slightly, surprised by the resistance. The exchange tightened into a rhythm: question, pause, answer. Each pause heavier than the last. The camera zoomed in, cutting between faces, Joy's raised eyebrow. Harry's unwavering gaze. A co-host biting her lip. An audience member frozen mid-breath. This was no longer a conversation. It was a standoff. Joy challenged him again, this time more directly, questioning not just his story, but his authority to tell it the way he had. The implication hung in the air: who are you to define this narrative? That was the line. Harry inhaled slowly. The kind of breath taken before a decision, not a reaction. When he spoke, there was no anger, only firmness. He rejected the framing outright. Not defensively. Not apologetically. He spoke about lived experience, about being told for years to stay quiet for the sake of optics. About how silence had protected institutions, but cost individuals. His words weren't dramatic, they were resolute. The room was silent now. No applause. No murmurs. Just the low hum of studio equipment and the weight of live television pressing down on everyone present. Joy attempted to interject, a quick clarification, a reframing, but Harry continued, still measured, still controlled. Each sentence peeled back another layer of the assumption that he was there to perform. He wasn't. He was there to confront. The audience reacted in fragments, a gasp here, a nervous laugh there, someone whispering under their breath. The co-hosts exchanged glances that said more than words ever could. This had gone far beyond the outline. The power dynamic had shifted. And in that moment, with cameras locked in, producers frozen, and millions watching live, it became clear that this wasn't just a heated debate anymore. It was a turning point. And in that moment, with the world watching live, everything changed. Harry didn't raise his voice. That was the first thing everyone noticed. In a room built for spectacle, for interruptions, for sharp one-liners, for emotional eruptions, he did the opposite. He slowed down. He straightened in his chair. He placed both feet firmly on the ground, as if anchoring himself to something deeper than the studio floor. And then he spoke. Not defensively. Not theatrically. But with a clarity that cut straight through the noise. He began by acknowledging the skepticism, not conceding to it, but naming it. He spoke about how easy it is to question someone's motives when you've never lived their consequences. About how neat narratives are comforting, even when they're incomplete. His words weren't accusations. They were observations, and that made them far more unsettling. The audience leaned in. Harry described what it feels like to grow up without the luxury of anonymity. To have your worst days immortalized, your private grief debated by strangers, your silence interpreted as guilt and your honesty labeled strategy. Each sentence landed carefully, like a measured step forward. Then came the pivot. He addressed the idea, unspoken but unmistakable, that telling his story was somehow an act of betrayal. He rejected it calmly, almost gently. He said that loyalty to institutions should never require the erasure of individual pain. That respect for tradition should not come at the cost of truth. Gasps rippled through the audience. The camera cut to Joy. For the first time, she wasn't leaning forward. She wasn't interrupting. Her expression had shifted, not to anger, but to calculation. This wasn't the response she'd anticipated. This wasn't deflection or apology. This was resolve. Harry continued. He spoke about silence, how it's often framed as dignity, when in reality it can be coercion. How people in power benefit from quiet compliance, while those who suffer are told to endure for the greater good. He didn't name names. He didn't need to. The implication was unmistakable. The room went completely still. Even the co-host stopped moving. One sat frozen with her hands clasped. Another stared down at the table, eyes wide. The audience, moments ago restless and murmuring, now seemed afraid to breathe. Harry paused. The silence stretched. That pause, deliberate, heavy, did more than any raised voice ever could. It forced the weight of his words to settle. It invited everyone watching to confront an uncomfortable question: what if he's right? Then came the line that changed everything. He spoke about dignity, not as something granted by titles or platforms, but as something inherent. Something no institution, no headline, no panel of commentators has the authority to strip away. He said that speaking honestly about lived experience isn't an attack, it's an assertion of humanity. The audience reacted instantly. A collective inhale. A scattered gasp. Then, applause. Not the polite, cue-driven clapping of daytime television. This was uneven. Emotional. Uncontrolled. People clapped before they realized they were doing it. A few stood. Others covered their mouths in disbelief. The camera cut again. Joy blinked. Once. Twice. She tried to interject, a quick attempt to regain footing, but the moment had slipped beyond the format. Harry finished his thought without rushing, without anger, without retreating. And then he stopped. No flourish. No smile. No challenge. Just stillness. For a beat, no one spoke. That was the mic drop. In control rooms across the network, producers scrambled. Social media feeds exploded in real time. Clips were being clipped before the segment even ended. Tweets flooded timelines: "This is unreal. Harry just said what no one else would. Did The View just lose control of their own show?" Hashtags began trending within minutes. Some in support. Some in outrage. All unmistakably engaged. Back in the studio, the applause faded into an uneasy quiet. Joy shifted in her seat, visibly recalibrating. Her expression wasn't fury, it was something more unsettling. Recognition. She nodded slowly, attempting to steer the conversation back into familiar territory, but the energy had changed. The audience no longer saw a guest on trial. They saw a man who had just reframed the entire exchange. Harry sat back, composed, hands folded once more. The storm he'd unleashed wasn't loud, it was seismic. The co-hosts followed cautiously, their questions softer now, more tentative. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly. What had begun as a challenge had become a reckoning, not just for Harry, but for the format itself. Outside the studio, the reaction was instantaneous and relentless. Commentators paused mid-broadcast to react. Clips looped endlessly. Supporters praised his composure. Critics accused him of manipulation. But even the critics couldn't deny one thing: he had won the moment. Not by overpowering. Not by humiliating. But by refusing to be diminished. Joy, for all her experience, had underestimated one crucial factor: that calm conviction can be more disruptive than outrage. That a man who has already lost everything he's accused of exploiting has nothing left to fear from accusation. As the segment moved toward its end, the tension didn't dissipate. It hardened. Because everyone in that studio, and millions watching at home, knew they had just witnessed something that couldn't be undone. A line had been crossed. A narrative had fractured. And while the applause faded and the cameras prepared to cut away, one truth lingered heavily in the air: this wasn't the end of the story. But no one expected what would follow next, what no one saw coming. The cameras eventually cut away, but the moment didn't end. It multiplied. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere. Newsrooms that had planned routine coverage scrapped their rundowns. Producers pulled the footage, replaying it on loop. Lower thirds flashed urgent language, tense exchange on The View. Prince Harry clashes with Joy Behar live. Daytime TV moment goes viral. The news cycle didn't just react. It erupted. Social media moved faster than broadcast ever could. Short clips sliced the exchange into bite-sized detonations, Harry's pause, Joy's expression, the sudden applause. Each fragment took on a life of its own, stripped of context, amplified by algorithms hungry for outrage. Memes flooded timelines. Some painted Harry as calm, unshakable, a man finally refusing to be talked over. Others mocked the moment, reframing it as performance, manipulation, theater. Screenshots of Joy's frozen expression circulated with captions ranging from admiration to ridicule. Reaction videos stacked by the thousands, creators racing to stake their claim on the moment. Hashtags trended globally. Supporters rallied around themes of dignity and truth. Critics fired back with accusations of privilege and deflection. Comment sections became battlegrounds, long threads collapsing into insults, values clashing in real time. But one thing was undeniable: people were watching. Celebrities weighed in almost immediately. Some praised Harry's composure, calling it a masterclass in restraint. Others defended Joy, framing her questions as necessary scrutiny in an age of celebrity victimhood. Political commentators pulled the moment into broader cultural debates: media power, institutional loyalty, the limits of public sympathy. Everyone had an angle. Cable panels argued late into the night. Was this accountability or ambush? Courage or calculation? A breakthrough moment, or a carefully staged one? Each outlet framed the clash to fit its audience, reinforcing bubbles rather than bridging them. The divide widened. Fans felt validated. They saw someone finally push back against a system that profits from personal pain. They shared the clip with captions like "This is what dignity looks like, and you can't gaslight lived experience." Critics, equally energized, felt provoked. They accused Harry of rewriting history, of weaponizing vulnerability, of exploiting platforms while criticizing them. For them, the applause wasn't affirmation, it was manipulation. And in the middle sat millions of undecided viewers, people who hadn't followed every headline, who weren't invested in royal drama, but who recognized something familiar in the exchange. A power imbalance. A public challenge. A refusal to back down. That recognition mattered. Because this wasn't just about Prince Harry or Joy Behar anymore. It had become a proxy war for larger anxieties, about who gets to speak, who gets believed, and who controls the framing when stories collide with institutions. Media critics dissected the segment frame by frame. Body language experts analyzed pauses and posture. Think pieces bloomed overnight, each claiming to decode the real meaning of the exchange. Some argued The View had lost control of its own format. Others insisted the show had done exactly what it was designed to do: provoke, confront, expose. The headlines kept escalating. A daytime TV reckoning. When the guest refuses the script. Calm as a weapon, why this moment hit so hard? The longer the debate raged, the clearer it became that something had fractured. Not just opinions, but trust. Viewers questioned whether interviews were truly conversations or carefully managed trials. Whether vulnerability was allowed only when it fit a narrative. Whether challenging power was acceptable, as long as the challenge came from the right person. And that fracture extended beyond media. People shared their own stories in response. Threads emerged from individuals who had felt talked over, dismissed, or reduced to motives instead of experiences. The moment became a mirror, reflecting frustrations far larger than a single interview. That's when the chaos began to crystallize into something else. Validation. Not universal agreement, but recognition. The sense that something real had broken through the performance. That for a brief moment, the usual rules had been disrupted. And disruption scares systems that rely on predictability. As the outrage cycled and the praise intensified, one truth grew impossible to ignore: this moment would not fade quietly. It had embedded itself into the cultural bloodstream, referenced, debated, recontextualized. But beneath the noise, beneath the memes, the headlines, the shouting matches, something deeper pulsed. A question that refused to go away. What happens when someone refuses to play the role assigned to them, that because underneath the noise was a deeper lesson, one about power, dignity, and the cost of speaking truth to influence? When the volume finally turned down, when the clips stopped looping and the arguments grew tired, what remained wasn't a winner or a loser. It was a lesson. The clash between Prince Harry and Joy Behar wasn't important because of who spoke louder, or who controlled the room. It mattered because it revealed something fundamental about the moment we're living in, a moment where truth, power, and identity are constantly negotiating for space. At its core, this wasn't a debate about royalty or television. It was about dignity. Dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't beg for permission. It doesn't require unanimous approval. It simply insists on being recognized, even when it makes people uncomfortable. What Harry demonstrated wasn't perfection or moral superiority. It was restraint under pressure. The refusal to collapse into the role others were eager to assign him. That matters. Because in a culture that rewards outrage and spectacle, calm conviction is disruptive. It slows the conversation. It forces people to listen. It exposes the difference between challenging ideas and dismissing experiences. The exchange also revealed something uncomfortable about accountability. We often say we want honesty, but only when it arrives neatly packaged, stripped of complexity, and aligned with expectations. The moment honesty disrupts established narratives, it's questioned. Motives are dissected. Character is put on trial. What unfolded on that stage was a reminder that accountability must cut both ways. It applies to institutions as much as individuals. To platforms as much as guests. To those asking the questions as much as those answering them. And perhaps the most powerful takeaway wasn't what Harry said, but how he said it. There was no explosion. No insult. No attempt to dominate. Instead, there was patience. Clarity. A willingness to sit in silence and let the weight of truth speak for itself. That kind of courage doesn't trend easily, but it endures. It's lightning in a storm. For the audience watching, this moment landed differently depending on where they stood. Some felt affirmed. Others felt challenged. But almost everyone felt something, and that emotional response is where growth begins. Because this wasn't just a public figure standing his ground. It was a mirror. How many times have people been questioned not for what they experienced, but for why they dared to speak about it? How often has vulnerability been treated as strategy, pain dismissed as performance, silence praised while truth is punished? The lesson here isn't to take sides. It's to recognize the power of composure. To understand that standing up for yourself doesn't always look like shouting back. Sometimes it looks like refusing to be diminished. Like holding your ground without hardening your heart. This moment also challenges us as viewers. Are we consuming conflict, or learning from it? Are we reacting, or reflecting? Are we rewarding noise, or integrity? Because every share, every comment, every moment of attention feeds a system. And systems change only when enough people decide to value substance over spectacle. That's where the empowerment lies. You don't need a global platform to practice dignity. You don't need a studio audience to speak truth calmly. You don't need applause to know when you've honored your own experience. The world doesn't change only through grand confrontations, it changes through everyday moments when people choose courage over comfort, honesty over silence, and respect over dismissal. What happened on that set was a reminder of that choice. A reminder that composure can be strength. That truth doesn't need permission. And that dignity, once claimed, cannot be taken away. And now, it's your turn to ask. What will you stand up for? So when people ask what really happened that day, when the headlines scream Prince Harry kicked off The View after fierce clash with Joy Behar, the answer is more than a soundbite. What happened wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a collision of values. A moment where a familiar format cracked open, and something raw slipped through. Where a guest refused to shrink, and a conversation escaped the control of its own stage. Where millions watching at home weren't just entertained, they were confronted. Confronted with how easily narratives are enforced. With how quickly motives are questioned. With how rare it is to see calm courage under fire. That's the lesson that lingers long after the cameras shut off. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about reclaiming dignity in a space designed to strip it down. It was about proving that truth doesn't need volume, only conviction. And it was about reminding all of us that the most powerful moments often come when someone refuses to play the role they've been assigned. That's why this moment mattered. Not because everyone agreed, but because everyone felt it. And now, the conversation doesn't belong to a studio, a network, or a headline. It belongs to you. So here's the question, and it's not rhetorical: where do you stand? Do you believe dignity can survive scrutiny? Do you think calm truth is stronger than outrage? Or do you see this moment as proof that our culture no longer knows how to listen? Drop your perspective in the comments, not just a reaction, but a reflection. This channel isn't about shouting matches. It's about unpacking the moments that reveal something deeper about who we are. And where we're headed. If this story made you pause. If it challenged you. If it put words to something you felt but haven't seen expressed, then share it. Send it to someone who still believes conversations matter. Someone who's been talked over. Someone who's learned the hard way that silence is often demanded, not chosen. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Because this channel exists for moments exactly like this, moments when media, power, and human experience collide. Moments that don't fit neatly into headlines. Moments that deserve context, depth, and honesty. What happened here isn't the end. It's part of a larger pattern, one we'll continue to explore. Because this wasn't the first time a narrative cracked under pressure. And it won't be the last. The next story is already unfolding. Another interview. Another confrontation. Another moment where someone is expected to stay quiet, and doesn't. So stay with us. The world watched. Now you decide what comes next.